right, hi everybody. Today I'd like to talk to you about island biogeography and species area curves. So if you take a look at this image here, you can see what we call an oceanic island surrounded by large areas of ocean. And that huge area of ocean implies that the island is isolated. And so you might imagine an oceanic island can be an isolated place, isolated by ocean. But you can also apply the same idea to terrestrial ecosystems, in particular nature reserves or parks or other wild or semi-wild types of areas that are isolated instead by development. And so those nature reserves end up being what we call an ecological island. So anyway, if you take a look at this picture, it's a model I like to use for this course. If you look at California in about the 1800s or so, it's very different than the California we have today, because in California in the 1800s, you had these islands of exploited areas or developed areas that were surrounded by a sea, a wilderness in a sense. John Muir talks about riding his horse through the Central Valley, which is now Highway 5, where the wildflowers would be growing all the way up to the belly of his horse. So have a look at this awesome picture. You may not recognize this, but as an example, we're talking about, this is Malibu and the Malibu Pier, and around 1927 or 1928. This picture here, this is from the same database I'll show you in a second. Right over here. This is Pudding Stone Reserve. You can see Diamond Bar on this picture. So this is right by Mount San Antonio College, before Mount San Antonio College was even in existence. This is our local Mount San Antonio College area now. You can see right here in this picture, Pudding Stone Reserve. It was the same on that other picture. So that shows you 1928. This is from Google Maps just the other day. If you're interested, because I ended up going down a rabbit hole on this and having a tremendous adventure, but these all come from UC Santa Barbara's aerial photography website. So they have a website you can search by county, and you can find all these historical aerial photos of California. Is really kind of a cool thing. So anyway, if you have a look at California today, it's a very different picture. And basically what you have is instead now you have these little pockets of wilderness, and those are then surrounded by a sea of exploited or developed habitat. So it's almost the inverse of what it was like in the 1800s. And so that's what we're going to kind of dive into today and why that might matter. So California, just in the last couple of hundred years, is a drastically different place for animals and plants and wildlife than it was 200 years ago. If you have a look at what we call a species area curve, you'll notice that on the y-axis you have the number of species you have in a particular area, and then you have the size of the area. It's probably not a big surprise, but as the area gets larger, you end up with more species. And again, species, when we talk about that, we're talking about different kinds of organisms or animals. So if you had 20 mountain lions, for example, that would only be one species. If you had 20 mountain lions and 200 deer, that's 220 individuals, but only two species in that case. So that's what we're talking about. So if you start with a small area, like up at the top here, you look at a stream, well, only certain kinds of plants or animals would live in a habitat that is just the stream. But if you kind of back up and now you have the stream and the meadow, well, you have different animals that are going to live in the meadow, and maybe different animals that live in the stream, like fish, for example. So just having a bigger area where you now have two different habitats gives you some of that diversity. And the same thing goes when you back up even more. So the stream and the meadow and the forest, and then you can even go further and include the mountaintop. That ought to make sense, I think. Okay, so increases in area also tend to increase and allow larger population sizes. So as you have a larger population size of any plant or animal, for the most part, it ends up lowering the risk of extinction, in part because you tend to have more genetic diversity. So more genetic diversity in a larger population becomes less prone to problems related to inbreeding. High levels of genetic diversity tend to increase the resistance to environmental change. The environment is changing, and genetic diversity allows populations to sort of deal with that better. But also remember your pyramids of biomass. And so if you had a big reserve, and in this case, let's just pretend it's an area large enough for 200,000 pounds of autotrophs. Well, remember that as you move up in the pyramid of biomass, there's less and less organisms above it because of the second law of thermodynamics. You're always losing energy as you go up. So if you had 200,000 pounds of autotrophs, you could have around 20,000 pounds or so of whatever was eating those plants. And if you moved all the way up to the mountain lion in this case, you could only have, one or two mountain lions. But if you take that same area and break it down into 4 smaller areas, but collectively they're the same, meaning you had an area that could have 200,000 pounds of plants, but now you have 4 smaller reserves that is enough in each one for 50,000 pounds of autotrophs. So it's the same amount of space and weight of plants. But the problem is because they're separated and each one only really has 50,000 pounds of autotrophs, as you move up, you can't even have a mountain lion in. You can have one mountain lion in because there's not enough energy left at the top of that pyramid of biomass for even one mountain lion. So you have no mountain lion. Well, what happens then is, first of all, you lose that one species right there. That should make sense. But also, whatever the mountain lion eats, the deer population, let's say, well, the population of those takes off because there's no predator eating them. And whatever those deer eat, they now eat more of that because there's more of them. So let's say they eat a California poppy, our state flower. Well, they can eat all those and drive that plant to extinction. So now you lose the poppy. And if there's insects that live on that, you end up losing that as well. So here is a graph of the islands of the West Indies that show the species area relationship. And you notice the number of species on the y-axis and the island area on the x-axis. Sure enough, as the increase of the size of the island goes up, you end up with more species. So an ecological island is any area surrounded by a hostile environment. And by hostile environment, obviously we're talking about hostile to nature. So this is any maybe developed area and so forth. And it can be a little bit tricky because it kind of depends on the species, but we'll talk about that in other lectures later on. But that's what an ecological island is. Okay, so if you were to visit our Mount San Antonio College Wildlife Sanctuary, we have a bunch of different aquatic ecosystems in there. We have what we call a pond and a swamp and a stream. And one of the things you can see in our wildlife sanctuary are these little baby ducklings. These are mallard ducks, and these are the babies of the mallard ducks. And in the wildlife sanctuary, you can have a bunch of different species in there, but it's surrounded by Temple and Grand Avenue, and it's surrounded by student parking in the entrance to our wildlife sanctuary that's being developed right now. So you have different kinds of environments that are hostile to animals like mallard ducks. And so if they get out of the wildlife sanctuary, they're likely to be hit by cars crossing the road. And we've had many cases where faculty members have had to try to help out with some of these wild ducks because the babies are crossing the street and everyone sort of panics. So we occasionally actually will see that on our campus. Okay, another example is tiger reserves in India. This is a national park in India, and it's a true ecological island. You'll notice, for example, and you have this fence that separates it, but right on the other side of the fence is development. So there's not a lot of distance between the reserve for the tigers and development. Here's an aerial view showing you the reserve that is around 1,100 square kilometers. That includes the buffer zone, and the core area is around 400 square kilometers. And villagers can graze their cattle in that area and can also harvest wood in that area. So even though there's a buffer zone that impacts right away, right up to the edge, because ecological islands, we have developed right up to the border of the reserve in these cases. The other thing I want to point out, a few other definitions. One of them is the idea of what we call an endemic species. An endemic species is a species found in one location and it's not found elsewhere. And endemic species tend to be at a greater risk for extinction because their populations in nature tend to be lower. So one example, you notice in this picture, California and Texas have a huge number of endemic species. So California, for example, has species found nowhere else in the world. Another example would be in the Hawaiian Islands. There's a bunch of introduced species into Hawaii. In fact, if you go to Hawaii, one of the things you find is most of what you see is introduced species. But Hawaii does have some very rare and hard to find birds that are endemic to Hawaii. Many of these birds fall into a group that we call the Hawaiian honey creepers. So that's a group of birds that are endemic to Hawaii and are not found elsewhere in nature, at least in the world. I already talked about this, but I'll give you another example of this. We talked about the term extirpated. Remember, extinction means a species gone forever, but we have another term we use called extirpated. So extirpation means a species has gone extinct from a particular area. So in California, grizzly bears used to live up and down the state, but there are no grizzly bears left in California. They were hunted to extinction, or they were extirpated is a better use of the term, from California. And it's somewhat ironic, I think, that in California on our state flag, we have a grizzly bear, which has been driven to extinction, but yet we have it on our state flag. If you look at the distribution map of grizzly bears, they used to inhabit the coast where Los Angeles is today and where San Francisco is. And so they were widely distributed throughout the state of California, but they've been extirpated. They aren't extinct in the world because there's some in Montana and Wyoming and parts of Canada and Alaska. Take a look at this really cool animal here. When I went to UC Santa Cruz, one of the professors that I took animal behavior from, I didn't even know it at the time. It's kind of embarrassing now looking back. His guy was a world famous animal behaviorist that studied this animal here called elephant seals. And elephant seals, believe it or not, used to not breed on the California coast. So now if you go up to places like Cambria, up north by San Luis Obispo, you can at certain times of the year see these beaches covered with these huge giant elephant seals that can weigh thousands of pounds. But in the past, grizzly bears would eat these and would hunt them on the beach. And so it restricted their breeding grounds. All right, so this guy here, Thomas Lovejoy, working with the Smithsonian, and worked on a project called the Minimum Critical Size of Ecosystems Project. And he was looking at the extinction rates in islands of tropical forests where the area around the forest was cut and converted to cattle pasture, which is a common practice in that area. So he looked at extinction rates related to island size. And on the right, you can see a relatively small island. And on the left, you can see a much larger island. The ranges of island size in this particular study were 1 hectare, which is about 2.47 acres, to 10,000 hectares. And he found some surprising things in the study. By the way, for reference, the Mount San Antonio College Wildlife Sanctuary, if you've been there, total area is around 30 to 35 acres, just to give you a perspective. So using the species area curve, he found the extinction rates were actually higher on the small islands than was predicted by the species area curve. And this related to edge effects, because it turns out the edges of the small islands had more basic edge, if you think about. So if you took a smaller area, if you did like a surface area, or if you think about buying a fence to fence off an area, if you had a really big area and you fenced it off, you would use a certain amount of fence. But if you had the same amount of area but broken into 4 smaller pieces like I was showing you before, you would need more fence because you have more perimeter space than you do in the larger one. And that creates what we call an edge effect. So small islands were impacted by wind and tree fall, and the middle of the tropical forest basically creates a lot of its own humidity from the water and the trees surrounding it. So the edges of these small islands were really dry. Okay, so another guy, William Newmark, did a study, his PhD thesis, looking at large mammal species and extinction rates in national parks. So if you look at a park like Bryce National Park, pictured right here in Utah, is a very small park. It's only about 144 square kilometers. So a place like Bryce National Park has lost 36% of its large mammal species. Yosemite, which is it's a pretty good size park. It's a fairly large park. It's 2,000 square kilometers, but Yosemite's lost 25% of its original mammal species. And it's a national park, so how could that be happening when it's a protected area? But once again, these parks are like ecological islands. So if you look at the largest park in the system in the continental United States, that would be the Grand Teton National Park. And so what you see there, in a little over 10,000 square kilometers, it turns out that ends up being a critical number. We'll mention later how big does a nature reserve have to be. That 10,000 mark tends to be kind of a really important number we'll see later on. So, if you look at the biggest park system is the interconnected parks that are Kootenai, Banff, Jasper, and Yoho down here. There's basically no extinctions. They still have grizzly bears, they have wolves, they have lynxes, they have wolverines. So the area is big enough to maintain all the original species. Here's a graph that shows data from William Newmark's study. And so you can see the extinction rate on the y-axis and the park area on the x-axis. And you notice as the area increases, the extinction rate decreases, which is what you would expect to happen.